Hello guys, it's Matthew Adams, also known as That One View Guy, and today we'll be covering something a little bit different than standard film review. So over the years, and in more recent times, my friends have asked me a very similar question, why I believe that films are significantly worse in terms of the greats than they used to be. And while I do believe that the overall film quality in terms of the worst films have gotten more watchable in recent years, I believe that the greats, the films that you really show up to the theater feeling excited or nervous or scared or inspired by the end of it, are significantly less common. And why I believe this is a multitude of factors. So let me get into the first one. I believe that a good film starts with the foundation. They explain the characters, they explain the inciting incident or whatever caused this event to happen to start the story in the first place. They explain kind of what we should expect in the film, and they build up to the next part of the film. And I believe a lot of films nowadays, they just kind of expect that we already know these characters are already established. For instance, you look at the Captain Marvel movies, and then you look at the Marvels. You're supposed to have watched Kamala Khan, and you're supposed to have watched all these series that uh, some people didn't even know existed or didn't want to watch. And I believe that that leads a lot of room for misinterpretation or confusion about where am I, what is this supposed to be, who's this character, and then they don't get explained because they think, oh, well, you've already watched this film. For instance, when I watched Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, I had a very similar issue. I never watched WandaVision as I do not own Disney Plus. And while some people might say that's a me issue, I didn't even know WandaVision existed at the time. So for me to have watched it doesn't make any sense. But they expected me to have watched all of it for it to really make sense, as they didn't really bridge the gap on why Wanda was suddenly evil or why she was acting the way that she did, because we never saw that in any of the other films. So as a Marvel film watcher, I never experienced the TV shows. And so therefore my experience was very confusing. It didn't really make a lot of sense. The motivations weren't there, and there was a lot of problems with me kind of getting behind it. Not to mention other things. I think the pacing was really slow in that film in particular. But that's besides the point. We have these films that expect you to have watched multiple series to understand, instead of being standalone and then maybe incorporating some aspects where, hey, if you understood this film a little bit better because you watched the show, fair enough, right? But when you expect the viewer to have already watched a show that may or may not have known to exist, it doesn't really make any sense. So relying upon a TV show as the foundation for a film doesn't make sense unless the TV show is the main focus. For instance, if you watch Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul and then you watch El Camino, fair enough, because El Camino is like a side quest, whereas Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are the main sources of media. It's very much the opposite with the Marvel movies. The films are the big events. The TV shows, while they do have their big events, are more cast aside, right? They don't get as much advertising as the films do, so therefore people don't watch them as much, at least from my personal experience. And so it creates a lot of problems where these characters are supposed to be established, but they're really not. And then we're expected to understand them or get along with them in a successful manner just because we're supposed to have known them from the show. Continuing on from this, I believe that overall the scripts and the engagingness of the characters has diminished. I believe that there was a lot of charm in the older films, not just out of pure nostalgia, but just because they focused more on the character relationships with each other. They focused more on the storytelling and more on the practical effects, more on how does this character feel about one another instead of all these characters coming together and doing one big action. Like for instance, the Marvel movies, or for instance, all of the new Disney movies, where these characters they're more of one fragment of a story instead of having their own story that builds upon the pre-existing story, which I believe is the format that was more commonly used in the older days, from my experience. So we have this problem where these characters are established in other universes or other movies or TV shows, but the film is not a standalone film. And there's, of course, the sequels are fine, right? But you can watch Jurassic Park 3 and you can kind of understand what's going on to some extent, even though the film by itself is just kind of confusing. You don't have to have watched Jurassic Park 1 or 2 to really get what's going on. And you can like the characters, you get to see the journey through the characters, you get to see the story that the film's trying to tell, and all these things. And it stands alone. As a kid, I watched Jurassic Park 3 before I watched Jurassic Park 1. I was just one of those kids. I grew up with that. And so, like, for instance, Terminator 2, you don't have to necessarily have watched the first one to really understand the film and get along with the film. And it fills in the gaps decently good enough. And it tells a very different story than the original does. So you get two very different stories out of it, even though it's almost repeating the same events. And so I think that filmmaking is significantly better in terms of not holding the viewer's hand, but also telling a more engaging and more exciting story. Next, I believe, is the budgets. The budgets have skyrocketed in recent years, but the quality has diminished. You look at, for instance, the Marvels. They went through multiple different directors and producers. They had multiple different ideas for the scripts, etc. And it wasn't even just the drafting period, which is like before they actually start making the film, just kind of like the draft. It was like midway through the film, completely flipped it on its head. They had completely different ideas. You look at almost all of Disney, and that's the case, right? Like, for instance, the Snow White film. They're rewriting it midway through, and it's been delayed, and there's a lot of problems with the film itself. They keep trying to change the direction, but they don't realize that, that's going to come at the cost of quality unless you up the production costs, which they seem very very stingy with nowadays. So that is another problem. It's just like the indecisiveness of the industry. A lot of companies, they make this really cool piece that people would actually want to watch, and then they dial it back because they want to play it safe. Whereas in the old days, for the most part, if you made a good film that was recognized and loved by many, it could completely change your existence. You could go from a small film company to a medium or a large company over one film. But nowadays, most films are made by already established companies. The small indie films are not really distributed very effectively, and it's not really available for you as much. There are some platforms that allow it, but they don't get the advertising that they need. Like, for instance, like the Disney movies, they get this massive advertising. I go to the train station, everywhere is like Disney and ads for Disney for like one of their upcoming films. But the ones that actually take risks and the ones that actually go for something unique are kind of silenced. Before, you go to the movie theater, in the earlier days, and you see this interesting movie that you didn't even know existed, and you go to watch it. But now, since films have gotten more expensive to watch, and streaming platforms have been competing so much with each other that they're all making each other significantly worse by taking away other films, it's left us in the same situation as, for instance, cable TV did, where you have to have all these channels to actually get the full experience. While as before, Netflix, while it was a sort of a monopoly, it allowed you to watch significantly more shows and higher quality shows than it does nowadays. And you have the problem where there's nothing really that exciting. I look at the best films I've watched within the last 2 years that were recent films. I look at, for instance, Oppenheimer. I look at, is that it? I think Oppenheimer is the only thing I've seen in the last 2 years that was actually good. Actually, I liked the Godzilla minus one or whatever. That was a good film. I think it was one of the better Godzilla films. But that's besides the point. I can think of 2 movies off the top of my head that I've seen. I did not watch Barbie. I'm sorry. I did not want to spend $20 renting it. I think I could probably get it now, but that's besides the point. And I look at the movies that people are praising nowadays, and most of them are either old films that just didn't get the recognition that they deserved, or they're modern films, in which case there's like 2 films that are actually watchable that I can think of. And so we get into the problem where there's not really any risk being taken, but it also doesn't allow for any creativity. You look at, for instance, Pixar is making their fifth Toy Story, but then they're also going to make their sixth one. They've confirmed is being in the process of being made. So they're going to continue to make the Toy Story series, even though it should have ended at 4, and they'll continue to do the same thing, and they will just make sequels for already existing products instead of making originals, because the originals have been flopping. You look at Turning Red, it got absolutely destroyed at the box office. Elementals, I think, barely broke even, if not lost money. Like, most of their films are not doing that great. And the films that are doing well are the sequels to already existing products, or reimaginings, like, for instance, The Little Mermaid and things like that. But if they made a Little Mermaid 2 remake, I think it would absolutely get destroyed at the box office due to the first remake not being actually that good. And so it gets into this issue where people are tired of the same things, but then there's no one really willing to fill in that gap. Indie movies don't have the budgets that they should have, because most films in the modern era are very difficult to run anything under a couple $1 million budget. There are some films that do low budgets and are very successful, but a lot of people do not have the experience to actually make a low budget film successfully, because they're comparing themselves to like Disney or Pixar or things of that nature. And that's innately the problem, is that there's kind of a monopoly on the film industry to some extent. You have Disney owns like pretty much everything. Then you have Blumhouse, which has just been working on all of the video game movies pretty much, but nothing really high quality since, what, the 2000s? 2010s maybe? I haven't seen a good Blumhouse film in quite a while. And that's kind of it. You have Universal, who makes some good films, but also makes some very poor films. There's no one really that takes my breath away. Like the good old motion animation films of the early 2000s to late 2000s, and then the 90s, right? You have like Nightmare Before Christmas, you have Corpse Bride, you have Coraline, you have Fantastic Mr. Fox. You have all these films that they're timeless. You have Gattaca, you have Hellraiser, you have The Thing, you have Hardcore Henry, you have films of that nature that I absolutely enjoyed and I've watched many times over, that don't really age, and they always work for me. They always have different vibes and stuff, but they all succeed in that sense. I think a lot of movies I've seen in recent years that have been poor, like for instance, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Thor: Love and Thunder, and then I watched Madam Web, which was a disaster. This is before I knew how bad it was. I watched it like the first day it came out, and I was incredibly disappointed. And there's also another problem, which is the last problem I'll cover, where films have characters that we're just supposed to love right off the bat. You look at Rey from Star Wars. You look at Madam Web even. These are characters that have almost no progression throughout their story, but yet always are all-powerful beings. Rey immediately is one of the strongest Jedi to ever exist, and then Madam Web can literally just turn back time, so there's not really any sense of loss or worry about anything. And it creates the issue where films that like turn back time, the only way, in my experience, I've ever seen it work is either if you make it really action focused or you make it really comedic. And Madam Web does neither of these. And so it creates the issue where it's like, what are you watching this film for? The side characters are sometimes more interesting, and the characters themselves that you're supposed to root for, you don't really care what happens to them. Anyways, that has been kind of my analysis of why I believe films are significantly worse in terms of the grades than they used to be. And of course, this is just my opinion. This is not factual. This is just from my personal experience and from my understanding of the film industry, which I have some understanding of. I really hope you appreciate this. It took a while to make this video, and make sure to like and subscribe if you like this content, and if you want more film reviews or you want more of this style of content, please let me know. Thank you, and goodbye.